I'm historian Alex Avina. Let's answer your questions from the internet. This is Latin America Support. Concerned Dad asks, how many Latinos live in the US? More than 65 million Latinos live in the United States as of our last census report. It is the single largest minority group in the United States. At Paul G. 9483 asks, I'm working on a timeline of Latin American history for my class. I'm going to start in 1492 with the fall of Granada. What other 5 events I should include? Well, I guess Paul's asking me to do some of his work for him, which I will gladly do. So let's follow Paul's plan, because 1492 is important for a variety of reasons. In addition to the fall of Granada, we have October of 1492, when Christopher Columbus stumbled onto what is now Latin America. In the early 1700s, the Bourbons take over the Spanish throne, instituting gradually a series of reforms throughout the 1700s that will eventually trigger a mass uprising throughout the region. I would say the third one would be the Haitian Revolution, where a slave revolt led to the creation of a modern Black state in the Americas. It was an anti-capitalist, anti-racist, and anti-slavery revolution, feared by all colonial powers around the world. So revolutionary Haiti was extremely important because it helped inspire revolutionary efforts throughout the Americas. Now this brings us to our fourth event that I would pick, Latin American independence. Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Spain in the early 1800s and triggered a crisis of rule in Spain's American colonies, where people on the ground did not know who they were subject to. This French installed government in Spain, or if they should start thinking about independence themselves, which is what started happening in some of the major Latin American cities. So by the mid to late 1820s, most of Latin America are independent from Spanish colonial power. Our next event is the Mexican-American War, which is really important for the country that my parents are from and the country that we're living in today. The US invasion of Mexico in 1846 resulted in the continental expansion of the United States from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, because the United States took between a half to a third of Mexico's national territory. This was the first time really that the US invaded one of its Latin American neighbors. But you had really strong resistance in the US, people from Frederick Douglass to Abraham Lincoln. The final event that I would pick occurred in 1910. And we're talking about the 1910 Mexican Revolution, the first great social peasant-led revolution of the 20th century, a phenomenon that would characterize the 20th century globally, from Mexico to Cuba to China to Nicaragua to Iran. And we cannot forget the Russian Revolution. And as we now know, thanks to recent research, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the New Deal, in part was largely inspired by the Mexican Revolution and its ideas of economic nationalism and social democracy. At Scrap Iron Liver asks, next door neighbors got all moved out yesterday, and today there are approximately 15 people with jackhammers ripping up all the tile and Mexican music at volume 11, and why does it sound exactly like polka? The reason Mexican regional music from the north, Banda music, Norteño music, sounds a lot like polka is because it has a lot of polka influence. And that's because you had European immigrants in the mid to late 19th century arrive in northern Mexico. Here's an example of Banda music. Now here's an example of polka music. Sounds similar, right? The flow, the sound. Latin America is the crossroads of the world. And this one very particular musical form from northern Mexico shows how European immigrants brought their sound, brought their instruments, melded with local forms, and produced something new, something popular, and in my opinion, something really enjoyable. Escape_Force asks, where is El Dorado? El Dorado, this supposed city of gold and untold riches, existed in the minds of the Spanish colonizers and conquistadors. What fundamentally drove the myth of El Dorado was how to become wealthy quickly through the acquisition of rich mineral resources, which then would allow them to become nobles. Even though El Dorado was a myth, it did drive actual expedition and travels from Spanish conquistadors from the Caribbean or from what is now Mexico north into what is now North America, to Florida, to what is now New Mexico. People like Coronado, like De Soto, like Ponce de Leon, who had conquistador experience in other parts of what is now Latin America. They went on these searches for cities of gold and fountains of youth. They failed to find those things, but what they did accomplish was to extend Spanish imperial power into areas of what what is now the United States that way precedes the arrival of the Pilgrims and other English colonists. And this is one of the reasons why the language of Spanish has existed in the United States longer than the United States itself. The next question comes from the subreddit Historians Answered. What are the origins of the Day of the Dead, and why did it emerge in Latin America uniquely? I would say that it didn't develop uniquely within Latin America. It developed in certain parts of Western and Southern Mexico. There's still a debate between historians and anthropologists about the sources and the roots of this holiday that is celebrated usually on November 1st and November 2nd. A lot of what we think are Day of the Dead celebrations that have been long held for centuries are actually more recent interventions. Actually, there had never been a Day of the Dead celebration in Mexico City until a James Bond movie called Spectre was filmed there in 2015. And they organized that Day of the Dead parade for the sake of the movie. Because it ended up being so popular, the city government decided to make it a yearly event that started in 2016. I'm sure we've all seen the movie Coco, the symbol of the skeleton, the symbol of the alebrijes, the spirit animals that are supposed to guide the dead into the realm of the dead. Again, all these things are facets and symbols that have been incorporated into the idea of Day of the Dead that may have not existed for centuries, but are actually been in existence only for decades. I Am Tara Lee asks, so Mexicans don't really celebrate Cinco de Mayo. I wonder why it's so big in America. That's a really good point. In Mexico, it's only celebrated in one really particular city, the city of Puebla, where this famous battle occurred in the 1860s between a poorly armed Mexican army that managed to defeat one of the most powerful armies in the world. The French, under Napoleon III, decided to invade Mexico, partly to get Mexico to pay back some of the debts that they owed. On the way to Mexico City, they stumbled upon this ragtag Mexican army, where on Cinco de Mayo 1862, the Mexicans managed to defeat this powerful French army. The Mexican commanders who led the resistance at the city of Puebla were loyal to then President Benito Juarez, Mexico's first and only indigenous president. He remained the steadfast leader of Mexico in resisting both the French invasion and the puppet Habsburg prince Napoleon III had installed as the monarch of Mexico. In the 1860s, Cinco de Mayo becomes a way for Mexicans living in the United States to affirm their Mexican identity, to the point where some Mexicans actually travel back to Mexico to fight against the French. In the last 20 to 30 years, US companies in the US realized that there was a big Mexican-American market, so they started to commodify the idea of Cinco de Mayo so they could sell things like beer. This went beyond the confines of the Mexican-American community to the point where Cinco de Mayo has become really an American holiday to have a good time. At Black Captain Queeg, do you know where the term cowboy came from? Who were the original cowboys? The original cowboys were vaqueros from Spanish-ruled Mexico. Spain, or the Iberian Peninsula, was ruled by different Islamic kingdoms for at least 7 centuries. So the idea of a vaquero, that encapsulated also Islamic, Arabic traditions. Alongside actual Spanish conquistadors and colonizers, we had horses, we had sheep, we had pigs, we had cattle who accompanied them. And that's where you get the vaquero emerging as the prominent livestock handler in the 16, 17, 1800s. So by the time we get the American cowboy in the mid-19th century, they were building and learning from long-held traditions of Spanish and Mexican vaqueros who had been around for a long time, who were drawing from traditions that went all the way back to Islamic-ruled Spain. At Normandy Light 7 asks, is Brazil considered a part of Latin America? Because somebody told me it wasn't because they speak, I think, Portuguese. Brazil is considered part of Latin America, regardless of the linguistic differences. Now, Brazil does follow a very unique historical trajectory. It gains independence in a way different from Spain's colonies in the Americas. It will have a monarchy up until the late 19th century. It will be the last nation in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery in the late 1880s. It's also useful to remember that at different moments, the Portuguese throne and the Spanish throne were one. That's just one more reason to think about why Brazil is fundamentally part of Latin America. At Adam Grubb 15 asks, what do you say to Mexicans who say, quote, we didn't cross the border crossed us? Historically, they're right. In 1826, this is what Mexico looked like. It included a huge portion of what is now the Western United States. So to really push through this point, I'll draw the old border on this current map of the United States and Mexico. The old border used to start contemporary Oregon, work its way down all the way to the border between Texas and Louisiana. This used to be Mexico after it achieved independence from Spain. In 1835, we have the outbreak of a rebellion in Texas against the central government in Mexico. This will lead to the Battle of the Alamo. This will lead to Texan independence. From 1836 up until 1845. What we now recognize as the US-Mexico border emerges as a consequence of the US-Mexico War from 1846 to 1848. The United States sent a force marching through Texas. That force eventually becomes bogged down in a lot of fighting in what is now the north of Mexico. Part of the reason why they get bogged down is because hundreds of mostly immigrants who are fighting for the US Army decided to defect over to the Mexican side. They formed something called the St. Patrick's Battalion, Los San Patricios, and they formed the light artillery unit of the Mexican army, and they fought against the Americans and put up pretty stiff resistance. The United States sent a different force from New Orleans, and they eventually make it to Mexico City after a series of really important battles. By September, October of 1847, the American flag will be flying over the Zócalo of Mexico City. Here's a question from the Ask Latin America subreddit. How would you group Latin American countries together into regional cultural groupings? Latin America is an extremely diverse place. It includes more than 650 million people, more than 30 countries, more than 100 languages, including European-based languages and indigenous languages. We can think about Spanish-speaking countries, Portuguese being spoken in Brazil. We can talk about French and English being spoken in some Caribbean basin nations. Historically, we can think about Latin America before 1492. We have power centers particularly in what is now central Mexico with the Mexica, or more commonly known as the Aztecs. We still have groups in Oaxaca, the Zapotecs or the Mixtecs. We have the famous Mayans that lived in southern Mexico and Central America. Mesoamerica was a rich, diverse area. There were certain cultural traits that shared spiritual and religious deities. One interesting thing to think about is the ball game, played by two indigenous teams. That ball game stretched all the way from what is now Florida to Central America. If we work our way down to South America, we have different Andean civilizations that had been there for thousands of years. Before 1492, we have the powerful Inca Empire. In the Caribbean region, we have the Taino peoples as well, who spread throughout different Caribbean islands. The Amazon basin was also a powerful indigenous center of cultural and economic practices. Another way to group this area is to think about the type of imperial influences in the 19th and early 20th century and how that imperial influence manifested itself culturally. So for instance, in South America, soccer is a big national pastime. In a place like Argentina, it's basically their religion. Diego Armando Maradona has his own church. A lot of these soccer teams in Argentina have English names. Why? Because it was the British who took soccer there in the 19th century, when Britain was really the commercial imperial power over South America. But we work our way north to the Caribbean, to northern Mexico. There, the most popular sport is baseball. Wherever baseball is the most popular national sport, that reflects a past history of US influence and intervention in that place, including in Cuba, where Fidel Castro was an avid baseball player and fan. At Blair Waldorfian asks, can someone explain to me why Frida Kahlo is treated as such a legend when she was emotionally a slave to an ugly man? Some might find Diego Rivera handsome, some might not. Frida did develop a very strong emotional relationship that they maintained throughout the duration of her life until she died in the 1950s. That kept them together despite Diego Rivera's inability to remain a monogamous partner. Frida also maintained her own liaisons and relationships with people. One of the alleged liaisons was with Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky, who arrived in Mexico in the 1930s, seeking safe haven from the Soviet Union. I think she's fundamentally a legend because of her talent as an artist, because of her honesty and her rawness as an artist, who was able to convey the emotional and physical pain that she experienced on a daily basis. Frida Kahlo suffered an accident when she was a young woman in a streetcar in which essentially a pole broke and pierced her body. She had to go through multiple medical treatments. She was in constant pain. Beyond her amazing paintings and her artwork, she was also an ardent, committed political activist in 1920s, 1930s Mexico. She was a committed Marxist who supported communist causes around the world. Diego Rivera, also an impressively talented, influential Mexican muralist. So they also shared a very strong political connection. If you've looked at Diego Rivera's murals, the common theme is that it's the everyday people of Mexico, the workers and the peasants, who have made that country and made that country's history. Sometimes when Frida comes up in more mainstream popular conversations. She's deprived or drained of the really radical political commitments that she believed in and she practiced when she was alive. I think about how during her funeral, there was a flag placed on top of her coffin, the flag of the hammer and sickle. So Frida remained a radical left-wing activist and painter until the moment she died. So here's a question from Quora. Who is the coolest historical figure you never learned about in school? So many, so many. Micaela Bastidas, who was a military indigenous leader during the Túpac Amaru rebellion in the Andes in the late 1700s. She was married to Túpac Amaru II. She was a very important figure in that movement that almost managed to overthrow Spanish colonial rule in what is now Peru and Bolivia. The coolest figure that folks may have heard about is Simón Bolívar of South America. @Livy asks, who the is Simón Bolívar? He's the independence hero of Latin America, kind of like the George Washington. He helped liberate South America from Spain in the 1820s. He did an interesting pincer movement where he liberated the north and moved his way south. His compatriot and revolutionary partner, José de San Martín, based in Argentina, liberated the south of South America and moved their way north. He is a complicated figure. He had a grand vision of uniting at least the north of South America into one big entity called La Gran Colombia, which would include the current day Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador. It lasted for a few years after independence in the 1820s. One of the tragedies of Simón Bolívar is that he dies in 1830, embittered, very authoritarian. One way that he thought that he could keep the Gran Colombia together was by demanding that he be made president for life, which was rejected by people in Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, a great Colombian novelist, has a great novel that captures the end of Bolívar's life called The General in His Labyrinth that I highly recommend. You have countries named after him. So when we think about Bolivia, this is a testament to the lasting impact of someone like Simón Bolívar. @Cub527 asks, how accurate is the Netflix show Narcos? I get this question a lot from my students. It's undeniable that there was a lot of drugs coming into the United States in the 1970s, in the 1980s. Cocaine changed the dynamic of the global drug trade in a variety of different ways. One of the things that's problematic about the Colombian Narco series is that the only perspective we get is that from DEA agents who were sent into Colombia to fight the Medellin cartel led by Pablo Escobar. And that leads to a lot of historical distortions in terms of Colombian history, in terms of Colombian political systems. The Mexico one is more interesting because the producers and the directors do try to provide other perspectives. Now in the Mexican Narcos, when the ruling PRI party was on the brink of losing power over the president for the first time in 7 decades. They were facing the challenge of Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas, the son of Mexico's most beloved president of the 20th century. The day that their votes were being counted, the computers that were used to tally the votes mysteriously crashed. This led to one of the most infamous quotes in recent Mexican history where one of the government ministers came out and said, "El sistema se cayó." The system broke down. At that point, I think we're pretty sure that Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas, the opposition candidate, was winning, was ahead in the vote count. When they restarted the computers, miraculously, the PRI candidate, Carlos Salinas de Gortari, wins the election, wins the presidency. @Watercloset, how did the United States come to be in possession of Guantánamo Bay? Cuba had fought for its independence against Spain numerous times over the course of the 19th century. The last effort began in 1895. And in 1898, when it seemed to be heading closer to gaining its independence from Spain, the US intervened militarily when the battleship Maine sailed into Havana Harbor and mysteriously blew up. The United States used that as an excuse to intervene in the Cuban War of Independence, at which point it became the Spanish-American War, a war between the United States and Spain. It was a very short war. One American government official referred to it as a splendid little war. The United States, after signing a peace treaty with Spain, obtained Puerto Rico as a colony, the Philippine Islands as a colony, Guam as a colony. In that same peace treaty, Cuba was to be granted independence, but the United States remained. Part of that negotiation also involved the perpetual leasing of Guantanamo for the purposes of creating a US naval station. Every year, to this day, the US deposits money into an account that is supposed to be paying for the lease of Guantanamo. Since at least the early 1960s, the Cubans refused to cash the American check for Guantanamo. Ulterior Kid 324 asks, why did Cuba become a pain in the ass to the United States for more than half a century? Now, obviously, this guy is the representation of Cuba being a pain in the ass in the United States, Fidel Castro, who outlived a series of different US presidents. But we really have to go back all the way back to the 1898 Spanish-American War, in which Cuba was granted independence from Spain. The reason why I put up air quotes is because Cuba essentially became a sugar colony for the United States well into the 1930s. This created all sorts of political and socioeconomic consequences in Cuba. It led to the rise of a dictator, Fulgencio Batista, in the early 1950s, a motley crew of rebels, of students, of campesinos, of activists, and one Argentine medic by the name of Che Guevara. They launched a rebellion against Batista in 1956, and after a few years of combat, they managed to oust Batista on January 1st, 1959. From the very beginning, there was tensions with the United States. By the middle to end of 1959, we have US declassified documents that are talking about, we don't like what this Fidel Castro guy is doing in Cuba. We should think about removing him from power. This leads to an attempt to invade Cuba, organized by the United States, but carried out by Cuban exiles who were opposition to the M26 movement. This is called the Bay of Pigs. This occurs in 1961. The revolutionary Cuban government manages to stave off the invasion, and in a Cold War era, Cuba is looking for allies, so they looked for that other big power in the world at that time, which was the Soviet Union. That's really the moment when Cuba becomes a big pain in the ass to the United States. Fundamentally, it has represented a big middle finger to what the US tries to do in the region. And this is one of the reasons why this blockade, embargo that the US has instituted against the island since the early 1960s continues in place and actually has been intensified and worsened in the last 10 years. Mexican Soda asks, I was told that the Mexican Revolution of 1910 was a unique one in that, as opposed to most other revolutions, it was actually led by the poor masses. How true is this? Well, it's complicated. It was a unique, authentic social revolution in that the peasant masses of Mexico did force it initially against the 3-decade-long dictatorial rule of someone named Porfirio Diaz. He allied himself with landed elites, foreign interests who collectively worked to take away the communal lands of different Mexican peasant communities over the course of 2 decades. That's what really triggers the Mexican Revolution of 1910, led by Francisco Madero, a wealthy landowner who had been left out of the Mexican political system, who helps launch a revolution in 1910. They overthrow Porfirio Diaz relatively quickly, and by 1911, Madero is president of Mexico. He will then soon come into conflict with radical peasant leaders like Emiliano Zapata, the leader of the most radical peasant movement of the South, and this is Pancho Villa of the North. It would take the defeat of radical peasant leaders like Zapata and Villa on the battlefield before middle-class revolutionaries could then incorporate some of these demands into the 1917 Constitution, which remains to this day, with some modifications, the Constitution of Mexico. So by the way, the figure of Pancho Villa ends up becoming extremely important, not just within Mexico, but outside of it. Now, Pancho Villa was a darling of US media and film. He had US film crews accompanying him on his battles, 1914, 1915. But then he became the ultimate villain, because in 1916, after having lost militarily on the battleground, he's left with only a few hundred fighters. So Pancho Villa came up with this idea: why don't I invade the United States? And he did. He invaded Columbus, New Mexico, in 1916. From Moonspector, why did Pancho Villa attack Columbus, New Mexico? He wanted to trigger a US invasion of Mexico to create a quagmire on the one hand for the United States, but on the other hand to make the current revolutionary leaders of Mexico, led by a man named Venustiano Carranza, look like they were selling out the country and thereby allowing him the opportunity to capture his military and political stature. Pancho Villa led La División del Norte, the Division of the North. It was a peasant army of more than 40,000 troops. They had hundreds of railways and trains. They even had their own air force with mercenary foreign pilots. All that ended after his defeats in 1915. The invasion of Columbus, New Mexico, he thought, would be his opportunity to reclaim the mantle of anti-imperialist, anti-US leader, and it almost worked, because the US did invade Mexico in return. This led to the Punitive Expedition, led by General Jack Pershing, where for months he traveled around, him and his American troops, including troops from the Buffalo Soldier Regiment, included indigenous scouts. For months, they scoured the northern Mexican countryside trying to locate Pancho Villa. They could never capture him. Pancho Villa used to put the shoes on his horses in the wrong way, so it looked like he was going in one direction when he's actually going in the opposite direction. There's an anecdote where supposedly Pancho Villa is up on a hill watching the Americans withdraw from Mexico, and he's purported to have said they came like eagles and they left like wet hens. At Queen Royce 15 asks, why telenovelas got to be so damn dramatic? It's like one disastrous decision event after another. Y'all be really salado AF in life. Go to a spiritualist para que te limpien. I love this question. Telenovelas are Latin American soap operas. In the late 19th century, early 20th century, their version of the telenovela was a novel form that always followed the same kind of plot and guidelines. That poor, racialized, working class woman strikes it rich because she managed to fall in love with a wider, upper class, wealthier man, and in them coming together and having kids, that representing some form of national unity within these Latin American countries. This plot is a fantastical one in a place like Mexico, where you still have racial and class considerations to take into account when we think about class mobility. In the Mexican soap operas that I was forced to watch growing up, there was a phenomenon of mostly white Mexican actors and actresses essentially playing brown face, Mexican face, when they play the role of the poor working class woman. So obviously there's a fantasy and then there's a reality in Mexico where poverty still looks, let's say, darker skinned than some of the displays of this in telenovelas. Yellow Lemon Bikini asks, favorite films to represent Latin American culture. One notable film would be the classic 3-part documentary series by Patricio Guzman about Chile called La Batalla del Chile, the Battle for Chile. A documentary that captures the Chilean attempt to wage a peaceful revolution in the early 1970s, led by President Salvador Allende. Patricio Guzman filmed this documentary series during the overthrow of Allende, led by Chilean General Augusto Pinochet. This was the one attempt in Latin America to achieve socialism through peaceful, legalistic, constitutional methods. Salvador Allende, a self-declared Marxist doctor, was elected to be president of Chile. This unleashed a ferocious reaction from the Chilean right wing that culminated in the coup d'etat on September 11th, 1973. The US didn't play a direct role. It did play an indirect role in helping foment the conditions for a civil war in Chile by essentially launching an economic blockade of this country for 3 years. President Richard Nixon said that he wanted to make the Chilean economy scream. And we have an infamous quote from Henry Kissinger, then National Security Advisor, in which he said something to the extent of, why should we let a country go communist due to the irresponsibility of its own people? And that quote captures so much of the relationship between Latin America and the United States during the Cold War. The next question is from Cora. How did the Che Guevara t-shirt become popular? Che Guevara had a significant historical role in Latin America, particularly during the Cold War era. Che Guevara came from Argentina. He studied to be a medical doctor. He traveled throughout Latin America in the 1940s and 50s, where he discovered and encountered for the first time, really, social, economic, and racial inequality in the region that started to radicalize him politically. That process eventually took him to Mexico, where he met one Fidel Castro, and he joined the M26 movement's attempt to overthrow a dictator in Cuba, and this leads us to the Cuban Revolution, where Che Guevara becomes an international symbol of revolution, of Marxism, of rebellion. Che Guevara was an internationalist. He believed in spreading revolution throughout what we now refer to as the Global South. He attempted to wage revolution in Africa. After that episode, he went and tried to start a revolution in South America. His idea was to spread a revolution from Bolivia to the rest of South America, including his own home country of Argentina. In Bolivia is where he met his end in October of 1967. The next question is from the Ask Latin America subreddit. How do you feel about people calling Miami the capital of Latin America? Miami is a really interesting case. It has a very recent Cold War history that witnesses generation after generation of Latin American migration to the city as a consequence of different revolutionary processes that happened in Latin America during the Cold War. Populations who saw themselves as losers of a particular political or revolutionary process would then go to Miami. So we have Cubans, we have Nicaraguans who fled the 1979 Sandinista revolution. We had Venezuelans who left during the presidencies of Hugo Chavez and Nicolás Maduro. You have different Colombian generations and Brazilian generations as well. This history of constant migrant and refugee flows to Miami allow us to think about Miami as not the capital of Latin America, but as one capital of Latin America. So those are all the questions for today. Thanks for watching Latin America Support.